Our speakers for the plenary session will be Naki Osutei, of course, the Associate Vice President, Social Impact Canada, Global Corporate Citizenship at the TD Bank. She's definitely ready to go. And of course, Andrew Chunilall, Chief Executive Officer with the Community Foundations of Canada. I was chatting with Andrew earlier. He's definitely ready to go too. And Natasha Smith, partner with Miller Thompson LLP. I'm going to hand this off to my friend and colleague, Ruth McKenzie, President, of course, and CEO of Cagp, to introduce this session. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sam. You know, I'm just a little nervous here. Sam LaPrad's a really tough act to follow. Sam, I'll be thanking you officially in the conference wrap-up, but I have to say right now that you have been just amazing as our MC. I'd invite all of our delegates to give Sam a high five or a shout out or a yells or whatever in the chat. I see some of that happening already, just to let her know how much we've appreciated the role she's played in delivering an amazing conference for us.
Thank you.
As we get started, thank you again to the Private Giving Foundation at TD Wealth for their sponsorship of this plenary. So grateful to them as our sponsor. We always work really hard to have our closing plenary both knock it out of the park for the conference and to have us all leave with a strong message in mind. So Naki, Andrew, Natasha, no pressure, but I'm really excited about this particular closer because while all of our plenaries have been well aligned with our conference theme, Reimagining the Future of Philanthropy, this is truly about a reimagined future. And without a future in mind, as all of you here who pretty much live, eat, and breathe the notion of legacy are aware, without a future in mind, there is no way forward. Everything we do is about the future, is about change, about envisioning a world we want to have, the kind of world we want to live in, and ensuring philanthropy is a path to get us there. Increasingly, though, there's a recognition that not everyone has participated in articulating what that future should look like, or has even close to equitable access to that same future, and all that philanthropy has to offer in getting us there. We also have a world plagued with growing economic inequality, a world where many of the issues philanthropy seeks to address or resolve are in fact created or exacerbated by a massive accumulation of wealth by a small number of individuals in our society. And paradoxes being what they are, many are seen to be some of our greatest philanthropists. Despite the obvious underlying ethos of philanthropy as being about benevolence and generosity, we perhaps need to at least consider that philanthropy has in some ways been a barrier to fairness and equality. Philanthropy can't be part of the problem. It has to be part of the solution. And part of being that solution is ensuring an inclusive and collective voice, representation, and participation in our future, in access to funding, philanthropy, and resources. There is so much for us to do at Cagp around advancing tax policy that strengthens charitable giving, or maybe ensuring best practices in how estates are administered. Our work is often complex, and educating professionals to help achieve excellence in strategic philanthropy and supporting donors on their philanthropic journey is a monumental and sometimes endless task. What I'm saying is, with just the status quo, there's so much for us to do. But one of the things I'm most proud of in my time at Cagp, and particularly in regard to this conference, is how we've delivered on that status quo need. But we've also had the courage to make room, to push at the edges, to explore those bigger or extraneous issues that are cursory to, but intersect with our mission, to consider where things can and should change, where we need to give a little and make room for something else. And I've encouraged Andrew and Naki and Natasha to go there. I believe, and I think we all know, that a little squirming or a little angst is a good thing. As the influential Clay Shirky said, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. But I think we also know that real change doesn't happen by staying in our comfort zone. As with our Frank Talks that many of you have experienced at our conference since 2016, we purposely don't have an interactive element because we encourage our speakers to share big, audacious, provocative ideas, and we want you to take it in and sit with it. And that's the format we're going with here. There will be no Q&A, but I encourage you to share your comments in the chat area as you listen to our speakers, and also, and even better, to continue that discussion in the social room after the conference, and particularly in your organizations and your communities. Again, our three amazing speakers are Naki Osutei with TD Bank, Andrew Chunilall with Community Foundations of Canada, and Natasha Smith with Miller Thompson LLP. They're going to speak one after another, and they're going to share their vision of a reimagined future of philanthropy. Naki, Andrew, Natasha, thank you for being part of this. Naki, you're on.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And yes, I feel the pressure, but I'm going to walk into it. I once had a colleague in the bank endearingly refer to our area corporate citizenship as the soul of the bank. He saw our work with social impact and ESG as helping to move the organization forward on complex issues that the bank, like other institutions, both experience and contribute to. Okay, again, no pressure. As folks in the business of doing good, sometimes we can go wrong. We make mistakes, we step back when we should step forward, or we call in when we should call out, or vice versa. And I liken this experience to being on a journey, trying to record the map of where you've been so you can guide others, while also trying to draw the map of where you're going so that folks can see the path ahead. Complicated. Whether you're an advisor, a fundraiser, a funder, or you engage in philanthropy in other ways, you've likely been attuned to conversations about diversity and inclusion for a long time, intensified over the last 15 months. In many ways, these terms have been positioned as a destination for our sector. But earlier this month, on April 6th, Bernice A. King, CEO of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, challenged this idea in a social media post. She wrote, "Inclusion does not equal equity, diversity does not equal justice, and tolerance does not equal love." And some may argue that her post merely reflects semantics. We know what we mean when we use these terms in conversation. But to that, I would offer, these words can also be viewed as points on a map of the journey we're taking. Different words take us to different places. I want to take you back for a moment. Throughout high school, I spent my summers as a summer day camp counselor in public housing communities across Toronto. And it was not lost on me that each spring, as we go into training, the corporate representatives that would come in to train us were all white, and the day camp counselors and the camp participants were all racialized. This was the case every summer for 5 years and in 10 different communities, with little change in that period, despite a corporate mission that spoke to values of diversity and inclusion. As a teenager, it was jarring to me. 30 years later, some version of this phenomenon continues in virtually every sector. The 2018 white paper, The State of Diversity in Not-for-Profits and Foundation Leadership, found that 87% of all executive directors or presidents are white. And in a 2020 study sponsored by TD, the Diversity Institute found that while racialized people make up almost 51% of the population in Toronto, they represent only about 50.5% of board positions. Similar patterns are evident in Vancouver, Montreal, and Halifax. And while I'll spend a lot of my talk today focused on race, similar disparities exist for other dimensions of identity, such as indigeneity, sexual orientation, and ability. Several articles have been written recently calling for an evolution in fundraising that shifts the emphasis from helping donors feel generous, relevant, and appreciated to focusing more squarely on driving equitable outcomes and justice. And I want to bring Bernice King's quote back into the conversation. When I read "Inclusion is not equity," I was reminded of that summer camp context. The non-white camp counselors and participants were surely included in the group. I mean, we were the group. Numerically, we were larger in number than the white positional leaders, but there was no clear path or process to help us see the way upward or outward, leaving us with little reason to believe that the mobility that could address that inequity was even possible. And this is not unlike the experiences of some racialized staff of not-for-profit organizations who often create the scaffolding that hold up these operations, wearing multiple hats while being underemployed, and then face barriers when taking the next step into leadership. Inclusion invites those who have been marginalized to the table, but not necessarily to have a role in changing the shape of it. To go beyond inclusion is to consider equity. And I find the Kojo Institute's definition of equity useful here. Equity being the elimination of disproportionality and disparity. And to begin equity work in the context of the examples I've just given would be to engage with questions like, who is underrepresented in leadership? Who is overrepresented in work that perpetually meets a glass ceiling? And so now to diversity is not justice. As part of a framework utilized in organizational responses to disproportionalities and disparities, diversity has come to be a softer, codified way of describing anything other than white, cisgendered, typically abled, or other identities dominant in society today. And you hear that when someone describes an individual as diverse, as in a diverse candidate, or references an event as one with lots of diversity. What does this coded language do? It blinds us to the normalizing of whiteness. By virtue of the way diversity is used, we are centering white, able-bodied, cisgender, heteronormative as the norm. Everything else is diverse. And what's more, the mere fact that a group represents a range of identities is not an achievement if these identities cannot exist in the space in their fullness, or help expand notions of what is the norm. Diversity alone is not justice. Here's where equity, disproportionalities, and disparities can be a useful guide. Where we see gross and perpetual inequities may give us a clue to where injustice resides. And if we spend enough time trying to understand these inequities, we can find that they're connected to the legacies of one or more moments in history. For example, colonialism, slavery, the theft and conquest of the Americas. Not only have these legacies helped establish the location of wealth, power, and status globally, they've also helped inform societal values and norms, including values related to charity, generosity, and giving back. Before I talk briefly about tolerance and love, I want to share my reflections on how the work I've been involved in at TD has been part of a journey towards greater equity and justice. And I want to couch this in a recognition that I am a racialized settler immigrant to this land, working in a bank, a bastion of capitalism. I believe that recognizing this is important and necessary to doing this work sincerely. It allows me to recognize the limits of the impact I can have, but it doesn't stop me from trying to affect change, even if it is sometimes small, incremental, or symbolic. Almost 4 years ago, I joined TD to help build its new corporate citizenship platform, what's now known as the TD Ready Commitment. When I first joined, my role also included oversight of the TD art collection. I was so excited to connect the collection of art to social impact, equity, justice. I'm not an art curator, so I was really thrilled to bring on a fantastic curator who had experience making these connections in previous roles and in his academic work. Since the inception of the collection in 1967, its objective has been to tell the story of Canada. But when we examined, through admittedly a rudimentary and unscientific review of who was overrepresented and underrepresented in the collection, it became clear that with nearly 90% of the artists represented in the collection reflecting European ancestry, that the collection did not represent Canada to its fullest. To address this inequity, we needed to be intentional about our acquisition process. We put forward the recommendation that the collection focus on acquiring works by racialized artists to rebalance it and to build greater equity. In the 3 years that we've been on this mission, the collection has purchased more work by racialized artists than it had in its 50-year history. And incidentally, it has also grown in its appraisal value. In addition to the impact on the careers of the artists we've collected, this work has also had a ripple effect in the industry. Each time our curator goes to a gallery and asks, Which racialized artists are you representing? He's causing the gallery to rethink their own approach. There's a role we can all play in driving equity internally and influencing change externally. My second example comes from February 2020. We had just completed our 12th annual Black History Month program. The pandemic hadn't fully hit, and George Floyd was still alive. Together with my US colleagues, we decided to take a look at the TD Ready commitment through the lens of Black communities. We engaged community leaders, those working at the front lines of the issues underpinning the Ready commitment, and invited them to give us a perspective on how Black communities were experiencing these issues. What did a vibrant planet mean for Black communities across Canada and the US living without adequate access to green spaces? What did arts and culture mean for Black communities who are operating within a Canadian context that hasn't examined its racist history that includes things like minstrel shows? We hosted 5 two-hour sessions over a month and examined each area of focus within our strategy. This review has informed our ongoing work, particularly our focus on Black and Indigenous-led and serving organizations, and also the thinking of our business partners within the bank. This exercise showed how important it is to engage with communities experiencing acute inequities to gain deeper perspective, even on issues that we think we know well. And so who else are we bringing on this journey? TD employees. One of the ways we try to incorporate the spirit of equity and justice in our work is in the way we engage our colleagues. We've worked hard to dispense with language that connects volunteering to giving back. Instead, we've shone the light on how contributing to communities drives social impact and advances personal and professional development. A story I often share because of its resonance is that of Cynthia, fictionalized name. Cynthia had worked at TD for about 11 years, and she loved her job as an analyst, but she felt that she could further her strategic planning skills. A colleague suggested that she consider volunteering with an organization as a way to build that skill set. With the support of the employee engagement team, she was able to connect with an organization that works with parents of LGBTQ2+ youth. They were embarking on a strategic planning process and needed volunteer interviewers to help support the data collection. This volunteer role allowed her to capitalize on her analyst experience while contributing to her strategic planning skill development. Over the course of 6 months, she supported the organization's efforts, and by a year into this role, she had gained a better understanding of strategic planning that she could apply in her day job. But what happened about a year after all of this could not have been planned or predicted. Cynthia was at home after a long day of work, and her 14-year-old son came to her in the kitchen, unusually and visibly tense. He sat down and shared that he was being bullied at school because the students thought he was gay. A racialized woman herself, Cynthia had some understanding of racist bullying, but she could not have an appreciation for the bullying that her son was experiencing. But now, having had the experience of connecting with parents of LGBTQ2+ youth, Cynthia listened to her son in a way that allowed him to open up and ultimately to come out to her. Cynthia credited her ability to connect with her son in that moment to the work she had done contributing to community. A positioning of engagement as part of a larger journey towards equity allowed us to highlight the opportunities for professional and personal development. You see, we often talk about the journey, but not the map we're using. We've created a map to doing good, which includes being generous, giving back, ideas of diversity and inclusion. And some of us have known that this map doesn't adequately reflect the territory we're actually trying to cover, nor does it actually get us to the goal destination. But until now, a map, one that includes points like racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, made people uncomfortable. And so the language was softened, and we used a map with limitations. And I read once that using a map with limitations is like having a GPS system that shows you where you are at all times, but doesn't include cliffs. So you're happy with your GPS until you drive off a mountain. And in some ways, 2020 was our cliff. Some of us could see the cliff, others could sense it, and others still were relying on the old map and a faulty GPS. In 2020, COVID-19, the heightened awareness of anti-Black racism, gave us an opportunity to rewrite the map and include clearer points to help us along our journey. This moment presents an important opportunity to raise questions and use our power and influence to address them. Here are 3 quick questions that we can use as signposts on our journey towards equity and justice. What disparity or disproportionality is in our midst? How are we addressing the inequity and the injustice underpinning it? How are we leveraging it to influence broader change? The last phrase on Bernice King's list began with tolerance. She wrote, "Tolerance does not equal love." And I want to leave on a note of love, a word we don't often use in the context of work. But what is philanthropy, if not by definition, the love of humanity? And as Brian Stevenson says in his book, Just Mercy, justice is what love looks like in public. Let's help build a map to a more just and equitable future. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Naki, for those incredibly inspiring words and comments. I just loved your opening. The last 13 months have given rise to a new language, and some language that Naki used as well. Language that will influence our future and set Canada on a new pathway. We hear words and phrases such as transformation, build back better, just recovery, and inclusive economies. Even this closing plenary is entitled Reimagining the Future of Philanthropy. I am sure all of you have become familiar with these words and phrases as they show up everywhere, including the last few days of this conference. From this, we should be absolutely clear. Economic and social inequality is plaguing our communities at a dangerously high level. We should also be clear, we are at the advent of building a new economy, a new outlook, and a new psychology that will address inequality unlike the way that we have seen it in the past. The question remains in front of us. What is philanthropy's role in the new economy? How will we address inequality as institutions of philanthropy? Before we answer this question, we must understand our history. Knowing our journey will help us inform our future. Although philanthropy's role has been to resolve certain outcomes related to economic inequality, we have also been a beneficiary. According to the Broadbent Institute, the top 20% of Canadians hold 68% of the wealth. The top 40% of Canadians hold 90% of wealth. From this, we deduce that the bottom 60% of Canadians share in a meager 10% of the overall wealth in Canada. Economic inequality is alive and well. In fact, 91% of Canadians think economic inequality exists in Canada. As we all know, the pandemic has caused further proliferation of this inequality, and the numbers are likely worse than the numbers I provided. We should also recognize that our donors typically belong to the top 20% of Canadians holding the vast majority of wealth. This is our paradox, and it's been referred to by the authors of Winners Take All and Decolonizing Wealth. Let me be crystal clear on this paradox that Ruth referred to in the opening. Philanthropy relies upon an economic system that creates excess wealth. This wealth is used to establish foundations, endowments, and set up donor-advised funds. In turn, we redistribute wealth to alleviate issues created by the same unequal distribution of that very wealth. We work on issues of poverty, providing opportunities through education, and helping our most vulnerable. We are fortunate to have philanthropic institutions which capture excess wealth creation and work with altruistic, generous, community-minded donors to do good. As a Canadian, I am grateful that we have this type of social infrastructure in Canada. However, is this really what happens? Are we effective redistributors of wealth? To help answer this question, I want to familiarize you with the term trickle-down economics, also known as supply-side economics. It is a form of economic stimulus in which tax reductions on the wealthy and businesses in the short term will spur economic growth in the long term. It was made popular by leaders such as Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Brian Mulroney. This form of stimulus has worked in the past. If spurring GDP growth is the measurement of success, GDP growth does flow from the successful implementation of trickle-down economics. However, the story does not end there. GDP growth is important, but ensuring as many people as possible can achieve economic empowerment through GDP growth is critical to alleviating inequality. A recent study by the London School of Economics has demonstrated that trickle-down economics does not resolve economic inequality. Why is that? Well, for each dollar of tax savings realized by wealthy people and businesses, 35 cents is utilized for spending. For the middle and working class, the amount is somewhere between 85 to 90 cents on the dollar. And for lower income Canadians, the full dollar is spent. Although everyone benefits from tax cuts, wealthy people and businesses benefit at a disproportionately higher rate, thereby perpetuating inequality. Now you may ask, what does this have to do with philanthropy? What does this have to do with our role as being effective redistributors of wealth? Think about it in the following way. Philanthropy is a form of economic stimulus at the community level. We provide much needed grants to support community organizations. We do this by investing excess wealth created within our economic system to create more wealth. Consequently, we distribute the earnings on the wealth, but not the wealth itself, entrusted to us by donors. Why? Because endowments are typically permanent and meant to last forever. As the numbers demonstrate, we spend somewhere between 3.5% of the value of our capital to upwards of 10%, depending on market returns. In my opinion, the business model of foundations is trickle-down philanthropy, the corollary of trickle-down economics. Remember, in trickle-down economics, tax cuts for the wealthy resulted in 35 cents on the dollar being spent to stimulate the economy, meaning the wealthiest people were accumulating more capital than they were spending, and doing so at a rate higher than anyone else. Don't foundations follow a similar pattern? We build wealth each and every year through the growth of endowments and donor-advised funds. The growth is consequential to GDP growth, which is supposed to be good for communities and society. However, if we never spend it and we only spend the investment income related to it, the obvious question is, are we resolving inequality or are we perpetuating it? Is it equitable or sustainable for wealth to accumulate endlessly in the hands of institutions? A critical outcome of economic growth is wealth. Wealth is empowering and wealth is uplifting. However, wealth must be deployed strategically and at a rate much higher than 3.5% or 10% to be truly empowering and uplifting. If we are serious about tackling inequality, we must rethink this notion of permanent endowments and disbursement quotas as low as 3.5%. As Ruth said, we can't be part of the solution if we are part of the problem. Earlier on, I talked about understanding philanthropy's history and where we have come from, so we can understand the things we want to transform. Trickle-down philanthropy is only part of the problem. It's a business model challenge and a technical one at that. Our history goes beyond transactions and business models. We have cultural issues too. The existence of institutional and systemic racism is real. Last December, the Foundation for Black Communities released a report entitled Unfunded. In this report, of philanthropic institutions evaluated, 0.7% of total grants were made to Black serving organizations, while 0.07% of grants were made to Black-led organizations. At the same time, Black Canadians represent over 3.5% of the Canadian population. From the report, we can see how the current ecosystem of Canadian foundations has failed to address the complex needs of a particular community in Canada. Our work with the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund would indicate a similar pattern with Indigenous communities throughout Canada. 2 months ago, a Statistics Canada survey created in collaboration with sector representatives found that immigrants and racialized people are underrepresented on governing boards of charities and nonprofits in Canada. Keep in mind that as a country, by 2036, more than 50% of Canadians will be people of color. In some urban areas, the scale has already tipped. As a sector, we have work to do. Philanthropic institutions do not reflect the diversity of communities they serve by way of leadership or governance. The cultural and representation of a diverse leadership group in this sector will make a difference. Let me give you a real-life example. As I mentioned, the Foundation for Black Communities commissioned a report called Unfunded. As a call to action, they requested philanthropic institutions across Canada transfer an amount equal to 3.5% of the market value of their respective capital bases to reflect the current portion of Black Canadians in Canada. To date, 2 private foundations responded to the request and have answered the call and will transfer 3.5%. The 2 foundations are the In Spirit Foundation and the Laidlaw Foundation, 2 organizations led by leaders of color. Leaders of color will make a difference in our sector. Diversity is a requirement for business model and cultural transformation. Finally, reimagining philanthropy does not end with the eradicating of trickle-down philanthropy or addressing the extreme lack of diversity and dealing with systemic and institutional racism. We must understand and come to grips with our roles as investors. According to recent data by Imagine Canada, public and private foundations hold $92 billion in assets collectively. We are investors with great influence and reach. Our history as investors and where we currently stand is to invest to maximize return. As pension funds, asset managers, exchange-traded funds are rushing to invest responsibly and sustainably, so must philanthropic institutions. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, in his 2021 letter to CEOs said, and I quote, "There is no company whose business model won't be profoundly affected by the transition to a net zero economy." End of quote. If Larry Fink is right, are philanthropic institutions asking how a transition to net zero will impact our business models? After all, we have $92 billion as investors. Larry Fink also said, net zero demands a transformation of the entire economy, end of quote. And this includes philanthropy. William Bridges is an author and leading expert on transformation. Bridges juxtaposes change and transformation as follows. Change is situational. Transformation, on the other hand, is psychological. It is not those events, but rather the self-redefinition that you have to go through in order to incorporate any of those changes into your life. Without transformation, a change is just a rearrangement of the furniture. The sector, its leaders, its governors need to stop rearranging the furniture. We must strive for transformation. Incremental changes will not serve communities in the 21st century. A just and equitable recovery demands it from us. Many leaders and governors will resist these changes. If so, it's time to invite others to lead and invite others to govern in this new economy. We need bold, intentional, and courageous leaders. Nothing else will do. The resiliency of Canadian communities depends upon it. Philanthropic organizations are used to addressing community issues that exist beyond its institutional borders. Are we able to effectively address issues that exist within it? We need more than imagination. We need action. Over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Andrew. So like any good lawyer, I'm going to start with the disclaimer that I was invited to this platform today to present at the first conference I ever attended as a junior lawyer, and that the views I'm about to express are those of my own and not of my firm. Let's begin. If you would have asked me a year ago to compare the US and Canada using one factor, I would have said tolerance. More specifically, and maybe after a few glasses of wine, I hypothetically might have gone on unsolicited to say, the US is a nation that gives too large a soapbox to the ignorant. Its people espouse a confusing sense of patriotism for a country that doesn't really seem to care about their well-being. And the systemic racism in all of its institutions and many of its domestic policies is so pervasive that it's a miracle that anyone who's not white and rich finds the gumption to get on and up with it, hypothetically. A year later, the irony of my comparison factor is uncomfortable, because tolerating people does nothing to ensure that minority populations are afforded with the opportunity to participate fully in Canadian society. Tolerating people does nothing to mitigate the fact that 30% of federal inmates in Canada are Indigenous, despite making up 4.9% of the population, and that number rises to 65% in Saskatchewan. Tolerating people does nothing to address the systemic biases that result in consistent underscreening of Black Canadian women for cervical and breast cancer. And tolerating people has certainly gone out the window when we consider the rise in anti-Asian discrimination and physical attacks on Asians in our community during this pandemic. You see, the difference is that the US is big and loud, and so its problems are big and loud and amplified as a result of the American-designed foreign-made soapbox that it gives itself. Canada is small, relatively speaking, and we tend to sit quietly with a smile on our faces while our glass house fills with gas. So often we are elated not to be the US that we ignore how much we actually have in common with it. There's no doubt that the events stemming from the death of George Floyd thrust issues around systemic anti-Black racism into our consciousness. Cue the trends. Blackout Tuesday, defund the police, BLM, hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. Lists of books, lists of Black-owned restaurants, lists of ways to be an ally. Black people wanted, D&I officer, equity and inclusion specialist, VP diversity and inclusion, board of directors. Let's circle back in 2022. What shouldn't be a trend, though, is philanthropy. Philanthropy. The desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donation of money to good causes. Good causes, what is a good cause? I was asked today to comment on the future of philanthropy, to talk about how philanthropy can play a role in resolving the challenges around the glaring racial divide and the growing global economic inequality. And I propose that it is better defining good causes, anything in my view that better enables underprivileged, historically and systemically marginalized groups to participate in all arenas of society is a good cause. A good cause is not only providing someone with a warm bed and a hot meal, but it's ensuring that this person is raised to a position of self-sufficiency. A good cause is not only a program that advocates for the disproportionate expulsion of Black kids from school, but it provides Black students with mentorship opportunities to help guide them towards post-secondary education and higher paying jobs. A good cause is not only providing courses on financial literacy, but lending money to individuals that are systemically barred from obtaining traditional financing to enable them to grow businesses and develop their own intergenerational wealth. A good cause is not one that engages in outreach efforts to better screen for cancers in marginalized communities, but that addresses the lack of culturally appropriate care and lack of training for non-racialized medical practitioners about racialized populations. Because you see, the system we have now says we don't want you to suffer. But if you're not suffering and you're surviving, even just barely, you're not a priority. And who do we see in disproportionate numbers within groups of those suffering and barely surviving? It's citizens that are Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, our BIPOC members of society. When you're barely surviving, you don't get the luxury of higher education, to participate and take in the arts, to own your own home and care for your own yard, to appreciate and care for the environment. Simply put, you do not get to participate in society, at least not to the same extent as the more privileged groups. Which brings me to the concept of allyship. Simply not being racist is not allyship. Acknowledging the atrocities committed against our Indigenous people is not in and of itself allyship. Having a gay friend or sitting with a gay colleague at lunchtime is not allyship. In the words of one of my favorite human beings, Selena Caesar Chavan, being an ally is doing the work. It is making yourself uncomfortable or inconveniencing yourself in order for someone who has systemically not been afforded with the same privileges in society the opportunity to succeed, not to get by, to succeed. It is taking steps to level the playing field so that everyone gets to play, so that everyone can participate equally in society. So philanthropy can be a form of allyship. And it's in a society where everyone is asking how they can be an ally, giving to good causes designed to create a transformative impact on historically and systemically marginalized groups to permit them to fully participate in society is allyship. We understand a legacy gift to be a gift left in someone's will. It generally reflects their values and desires, but what of the word legacy? Isn't a legacy simply what you leave behind? The stamp you leave on the future and the contributions you make to future generations? Leaving a legacy helps to bring meaning and purpose to our lives. And what is the purpose of life, if not to help others? But I would take it a step further to say that helping others for a moment, for a day, for a week, is not helping to change the circumstances that required them to seek help in the first place. And so throwing money into a system that is broken will never truly fix the problem. Learning to catch a brick that is thrown at you does not stop a person from throwing the brick at you. That is to say that being provided with the tools to survive within a system designed to make survival difficult for you does not guarantee your survival. And so if we put this all together, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that we should be catalyzing philanthropy and benevolence to create transformative, trendless change, that we can demonstrate our allyship by getting behind good causes that seek to ensure that everyone gets to participate in Canadian society, not for a moment, but forever. That there is equity in our education and healthcare systems and in our financial and correctional institutions. That we do what we can to leave the world a better place than when we got here. The future of philanthropy is not only helping a man by teaching a man to fish, but by dismantling the systems that barred him from learning in the first place. Philanthropy is the name, but sustainability is the game. So how can philanthropy be used to create sustainable change for marginalized groups? Well, perhaps a good place to start is understanding how philanthropy can be part of the problem. If donors continue to support organizations and institutions that maintain the status quo, then they will be, even if indirectly, supportive of systems that bar others from socially and economically participating in Canadian society. For instance, giving to a hospital in support of mental health programming is a worthy cause. But if that program does not have culturally adapted therapies that target cultural communities where mental health issues continue to be stigmatized, then isn't that program, even if indirectly, excluding certain groups from receiving much needed care? Giving to a university is a worthy cause, but if that university does little to close the post-secondary educational gap for Indigenous people, isn't that university perpetuating the chronic underrepresentation of Indigenous people in higher paying jobs? Donors can facilitate the change they want to see, and be the allies they want to be through their philanthropic efforts. Philanthropy can disrupt our preoccupation with maintaining the status quo, and when the status quo favors certain groups over others, philanthropy, when used in this way, is allyship. So I would suggest that organizations that recognize this and promote their efforts around inclusivity, and I'll say it once again, transformative change, will be successful in helping donors to leave their legacy. Thank you. Ruth, back to you.
I'm truly a little breathless here, guys. That was absolutely fantastic. You certainly delivered on our promise of an outstanding conference closer and on my encouragement to push and be provocative. Naki, I loved what you said about the evolution of philanthropy and how we need to go beyond inclusion to equity, and the questions we need to be asking ourselves about who's here and who's not and why. And I so loved how you integrated a story of art. That was just beautiful. And also loved how you talked about driving change from within an institution. That's something I've often personally struggled with. So you've really inspired me. Andrew, you shared some pretty staggering statistics, both in terms of equity and the grip of wealth held by a few and the perpetuation of inequality that our system set up. And everyone needs to read the unfunded report without a doubt. I hope somebody put a link to that in the chat room. And the challenge of having more leaders of color in our organizations is just crucial for us to embrace. So Natasha, you know, I think you might have missed your calling in the law. You have a follow-up career as a spoken word poet, without a doubt. You were absolutely fantastic. And defining what allyship really means was absolutely powerful, and how philanthropy is part of allyship. Well, thank you for that. I have to share with you guys, there were some great comments from the participants throughout as well. Things like, justice is what love looks like in public, of course, but I think what is philanthropy if not the love of humanity is something that particularly is going to resonate with our audience. And the philanthropic status quo is just rearranging the furniture. I loved how someone posted that. And I think also our speakers at this plenary so beautifully followed some of the other messages we've heard over the last 3 days. Senator Ahmedvar challenged us as a sector to show more leadership and to take more ownership, to understand where we sit with diversity and address challenges and gaps. And she presented the notion of philanthropy in a context of what moves beyond generosity to justice. Edgar Villanueva gave us a powerful message of undoing the construct of colonialism that so many of us have benefited from, and to consider philanthropy as a mechanism for redistribution of wealth with greater fairness. Yogesh Patella and Sukhminder Virk provided some practical thoughts on how to equip ourselves to better navigate conversations with clients, but perhaps more importantly suggested that we consider unconscious bias without judgment as a frame of reference. And I particularly loved how Sukhminder mentioned vulnerability, because we need courage to change. And as Brene Brown has taught us, courage without vulnerability simply doesn't exist. And now, Naki, Andrew, and Natasha, you've really challenged us to upset the proverbial apple cart. But I think most importantly, you left us with an incredible message of hope. This has all confirmed my belief that at CAGP, we can't be the organization we really want to be if we are not an explicitly anti-racist organization. If we don't fully and authentically embrace inclusion, equity, diversity, and justice. We've tabled these issues over the last 3 days, and I've been blown away by the comments and the support that's been voiced by our delegates and our members. And as someone who considers themselves an activist at the core, and who over the last 30+ years has been on the front lines of many social justice causes, including the environment, Indigenous rights, prison justice, and the LGBTQ and anti-racism movements, this is amazing and exciting. And I look forward to considering how we at CAGP can better lean in and be part of the conversation and be change makers. Once again, thank you, Naki, Andrew, and Natasha. As a small token of appreciation, we have a Canada Helps gift card that will pop in the mail to you today, but you have really helped us end this conference on an unbelievable note. Thank you so much. And of course, a huge thank you to our sponsor, the Private Giving Foundation through TD, for being our sponsor for this plenary. We're so grateful to all of our sponsors, and the Private Giving Foundation has been there for us for many years and in so many ways. So thank you again. And now on to our official wrap up of CAGP's 27th National Conference on Strategic Philanthropy.